In the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, a war unfolded that no one fully understood at first, but everyone would feel forever. It was a war where modern weapons met ancient terrain, where ideology mattered more than borders, and where victory was never clearly defined. The Vietnam War would become one of the longest, costliest, and most controversial conflicts in American history. It destroyed millions of lives, divided nations, and changed the way the world looked at war itself. Before we begin this deep and eye-opening journey into history, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We bring you real, detailed documentaries that explain not just what happened, but why it mattered. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The Vietnam War cannot be understood without going back to the era of colonial rule. For nearly 100 years, Vietnam was controlled by France. The Vietnamese people were treated as subjects, not citizens. Their land was exploited, their culture suppressed, and their voices ignored. Resistance movements slowly grew, fueled by nationalism and the desire for independence. During World War II, Japan occupied Vietnam, weakening French authority. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh declared independence, inspired partly by American ideals of freedom. However, Western powers refused to recognize this new nation. France returned, determined to reclaim control, leading to the First Indochina War. This conflict ended in 1954 when Vietnamese forces defeated France at Dien Bien Phu. The Geneva Conference followed, dividing Vietnam temporarily at the 17th parallel. The North became communist under Ho Chi Minh, while the South became anti-communist, backed by the United States. Elections were promised to reunify the country, but the South, supported by the US, refused, fearing a communist victory. The United States became involved not because Vietnam directly threatened America, but because of Cold War fears. US leaders believed that if Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in Asia would follow. This idea was called the domino theory. As a result, America began sending money, weapons, and military advisors to South Vietnam. South Vietnam's government, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, was deeply unpopular. It favored elites, oppressed political opponents, and failed to gain public support. Meanwhile, communist fighters in the South, known as the Viet Cong, received support from North Vietnam and blended into local communities, making them difficult to identify. In the early 1960s, US involvement increased. President John F. Kennedy sent thousands of military advisors but avoided open war. After his assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson inherited the conflict and soon faced a turning point. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, where US naval ships reported being attacked by North Vietnamese forces. Although later investigations questioned whether the attacks actually happened, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving Johnson authority to use military force without declaring war. This decision marked the beginning of full American involvement. US troops began arriving in Vietnam in large numbers. Bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder targeted North Vietnam's infrastructure, supply routes, and cities. The goal was to force the enemy to surrender, but instead, resistance intensified. American soldiers faced a new kind of war. There were no clear front lines. Enemies hid among civilians, used tunnels, ambushes, and booby traps. The jungle environment made movement dangerous and exhausting. Despite superior weapons, the US military struggled to adapt. By 1967, the war had reached a stalemate. The US claimed progress, but the enemy continued fighting. Then came the event that changed everything, the Tet Offensive. In early 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year ceasefire, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. Major cities were struck, including Saigon. Though US and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled the attacks, the offensive shocked the world. The Tet Offensive proved that the enemy was far stronger than American leaders had admitted. Public trust collapsed. Protests erupted across the United States. The war was no longer just a distant conflict. It became a national crisis. After Tet, the war entered its most destructive phase. President Johnson chose not to seek re-election, and the nation was deeply divided. American casualties continued to rise, while victory remained unclear. Soldiers faced constant stress, fear, and uncertainty. Many returned home emotionally scarred. Vietnam suffered far more. Entire villages were destroyed. Millions of civilians were displaced. Heavy bombing campaigns expanded into neighboring Laos and Cambodia to target enemy supply lines, destabilizing the region and contributing to future conflicts. Chemical defoliants like Agent Orange were used to strip jungles of cover. While intended to expose enemy fighters, these chemicals poisoned land, water, and people. Long after the war ended, Vietnamese civilians continued to suffer health problems, and environmental damage remained severe. In 1969, President Richard Nixon introduced a new strategy called Vietnamization. The goal was to reduce American troop presence while training South Vietnamese forces to take over the fighting. US soldiers gradually withdrew, but bombing intensified to pressure the enemy during peace negotiations. Despite these efforts, South Vietnam struggled without full American support. Corruption, poor morale, and weak leadership undermined its military. Meanwhile, North Vietnam remained determined, believing time was on its side. Peace talks dragged on for years. Finally, in 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The United States agreed to withdraw its troops, and prisoners of war were returned. For America, the war was officially over. But for Vietnam, the fighting continued. Without US forces, South Vietnam could not hold back the North. In April 1975, North Vietnamese troops entered Saigon. The city fell, and Vietnam was reunified under communist control. The cost of the war was staggering. Over 58,000 American soldiers were killed, and hundreds of thousands were wounded. Vietnam lost an estimated 2 to 3 million civilians, along with more than 1 million soldiers. Laos and Cambodia also suffered immense destruction. The Vietnam War changed the world. It reshaped US foreign policy, increased public skepticism toward government, and transformed how wars were reported. It proved that military power alone cannot win political wars. Today, Vietnam and the United States maintain diplomatic and economic ties. Former enemies now cooperate, but the lessons of the war remain, a reminder of the human cost of conflict and the importance of understanding history before repeating it. The Vietnam War was not just a battle between nations, it was a tragedy shaped by fear, misunderstanding, and ambition. Its legacy lives on, warning future generations that war always costs more than anyone expects.